Here we are in my dining room. Normally, we would be going on an unforgettable field trip to the Texas Hill Country, but because of COVID-19, we can't do that. But I would still like to show you some of the fascinating geology that can be found in the state of Texas. So, our campus sits right about here. And remember, on these geologic maps, the colors correspond to different rock types and different ages. So these tan and yellow rocks are from the Cenozoic. So under our campus, we have sedimentary rocks dating to the Cenozoic. And they're very gently dipping towards the Gulf of Mexico. And on this field trip, we're going to drive out here across these Cenozoic sedimentary rocks. We're going to cross a major fault zone here called the Balcones Fault Zone. And that fault zone uplifted older rocks. And that's this green here. Green, it symbolizes the Mesozoic. So we're going to be in these Mesozoic sediments here. And then we're going to go all the way out here into this area. And that's uplifted Precambrian rocks. And that's the Llano uplift where some of the oldest rocks in Texas can be found. And we're going to be making stops in all of these. And another way to look at this is in cross-section. So this is a diagram that's a side view of what we would be crossing. So here is campus, right? There's Montgomery College. We're going to be driving across those gently dipping tertiary sedimentary rocks. We're going to cross that Balcones Fault Zone where we have these uplifted older Mesozoic rocks. Remember, the Mesozoic's the age of the dinosaurs. And then we're going to go all the way here into these really old Precambrian intrusive igneous and metamorphic rocks. And we're going to see some of the oldest rocks in Texas that date back to an ancient mountain building event. And the next stops that we will be taking on this field trip will be in various places along that route. Here we are outside of Bastrop, Texas, looking at the Lost Pines. These pine trees are loblolly pines, which like to have a lot of water. And this is what the pine trees out in the piney woods of East Texas are. Well, we're a long ways from the piney woods of East Texas in a much drier climate. So how can these water-loving pine trees live here? Well, that all comes down to geology and geologic history. Back in the Pleistocene, the last great ice age, well, back then, pine woods covered most of Texas, all the way from here over to the Louisiana border and beyond. Because during the Ice Age it was cooler and it was wetter and there was plenty of water for these trees. But then, as the last glacial maximum drew to an end, the climate began warming and drying out. And so many of the pine trees died out, which is why you don't see pine trees between, say, Houston and here. So what are they doing here? Well, the bedrock here is the Eocene-aged Carrizo sandstone. That sandstone holds a lot of water that supplies the water to these pine trees. And so they are able to live here because of that nice, porous, and permeable sandstone holding all of that water. Now, when you look behind me here, those trees don't look that big. Well, the reason is, about 9 years ago, there was a major fire in this area, and this is all of the regrowth since that fire. Here we are at McKinney Falls, just south of Austin, Texas. And at this location, we can see two fascinating things that tell us about the geologic history of this area. First of all, there's the rocks that we're standing on. These belong to the Austin chalk. Now, chalk is made up of all the tiny little microscopic shells of organisms that lived in a warm, shallow sea. So that tells us that if we would travel back in time, this area was covered by kind of this tropical sea filled with life. Well, when was that? It was in the Cretaceous. It was about 79.5 million years ago. And how do I have that nice precise date? Well, if you look at the falls behind me, you'll see that there's a cliff and it's kind of undercut. The easy to erode rocks that are under there, right, the ones that are being eroded away under the chalk, are a old volcanic ash layer that has been altered into bentonite. But we were able to date that volcanic ash to 79.5 million years ago, so that tells us that's how old these rocks are. It also tells us that there were volcanoes in this area at that time. So if we would travel back in time to this part of Texas in the days of the dinosaurs in the Cretaceous, there would be a volcano just off that way erupting, depositing this ash that sank to the bottom of this warm, shallow sea that was filled with all the life that made this Austin chalk. Here we are, south of Marble Falls, Texas, looking at rocks of the Ellenberger group. These rocks were deposited in the early Ordovician, and they are limestones and dolomites. And within these rocks, well, we can see a lot about the geologic history of Texas at that time. Well, first of all, these carbonates are deposited in warm, shallow oceans. And Texas at that time was sitting right along the equator. So this is a very tropical, warm ocean, and there was all kinds of life living in there. And we can see clues to that life recorded in these rocks. If we look right here, we see these white nodules. Those are chert. Chert is basically silica. It's microcrystalline quartz. And the life that gave us that are sponges. See, sponges are organisms that are kind of squishy. They don't have shells or skeletons. But they do have these things called spicules. They're little rods that give their body some support. And those rods, those spicules, are made out of silica. So when the sponge died and its body decayed away, that silica was left behind to recrystallize as these chert nodules. But we have more life that existed in here as well. If we look up there, you're going to see these dome-shaped things. Well, those domes are called stromatolites. And stromatolites are created by cyanobacteria, which are also known as blue-green algae. And cyanobacteria is a very successful photosynthetic organism. And they grow upwards towards light. And it's another way we know this was a shallow sea, because the light would penetrate for those stromatolites to live happily. Now these guys, like I said, they've been really successful. They've been around for 2.7, 2.5 billion years, and they still live in some places today. Well, if they're so successful, why don't we see them all over the place? Why can't you just go to the beach and see these guys growing? Well, the reason for that is that things eat them. Snails like to eat them. And we had snails in the Ordovician, so why weren't there snails eating these guys then? Well, it's probably because this water was extra salty, right? It was warm, it was shallow, there's lots of evaporation. We're going to get this extra salty water, and snails don't like extra salt. And so no snails, but we had sponges, and we had very happy cyanobacteria creating those stromatolites. Here we are at Slaughter Gap, Texas, and what we're looking at right here is the Town Mountain granite. And right there, that beautiful pink thing, that is a potassium feldspar crystal. And these are very typical of these sorts of granitic rocks. Now, the Town Mountain granite is about 1.1 billion years old. It formed in the Grenville orogeny. Now, the Grenville orogeny was a huge mountain building event that stretched from all the way here in Texas up to Labrador in Canada. It formed as continents collided together to create a supercontinent called Rodinia. When these continents collided, we had massive mountains formed that were anywhere from 22 to 25,000 feet high. And these granites are part of that mountain building event. But the rocks we have here, these are different. These are much younger. They're 540 million year old sedimentary rocks of the Hickory sandstone. We can see right here, inside that Hickory sandstone, there's all kinds of little pebbles of quartz and sand grains of potassium feldspar. Well, where'd this stuff come from? Well, those mountains that formed in the Grenville orogeny were exposed for a very, very long time to weathering and erosion. And the quartz and feldspar of those granites ended up weathering and becoming the quartz and feldspar sand that makes up the Hickory sandstone. There's more to this story than just that. This sandstone was deposited in what's called the Sauk transgression. A transgression is a major sea level rise. And in the Cambrian, we had sea levels rising to the point where almost all of North America, except kind of the very central part called the transcontinental arch, was underwater. And 540 million years ago, the beach was right about here. Those rising seas were right here, creating the Hickory sandstone and depositing those sediments here. But wait, there's even more than that. That's intrusive igneous rock. This is sedimentary rock, and we are missing a huge amount of time here. What, if that's 1.1 billion years, this is 540 million years, we're missing what, like 500,000 years of Earth history? 500 million years of Earth history. We're missing a lot of time. That's called an unconformity. Specifically, this is a nonconformity because of the intrusive igneous rock and sedimentary rock. But this is a very, very special unconformity. This is called the Great Unconformity. And you can see it, well, it's the Great Unconformity because you can see it everywhere. I have seen this in Nevada and where else? Montana and Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin. Okay, you can see this everywhere. And why is that? That's because at the end of the Cambrian, end of the Precambrian, we had this really long period of weathering and erosion before that transgression happened. So we have all these very old rocks with then younger sediments deposited on top of them when that sea level rise occurred. And that's what we're seeing right here. Here we are near Marble Falls, Texas, and we are looking at an exfoliation dome. Exfoliation domes form in rocks that originally formed deep, deep underground under a lot of pressure. When weathering and erosion exposes these rocks at Earth's surface, the pressure is released or reduced, and those rocks start expanding. And as those rocks start expanding, cracks develop in them called sheet joints. and you'll see a sheet joint there behind me in this rock. And so these sheet joints develop, and pieces, large pieces in some cases, of these rocks will fall off and ultimately end up creating this sort of rounded, dome-shaped outcropping like what we see behind me in the Town Mountain granite. Here we are at Backbone Ridge, and we are looking at a very special rock formation. That is the Lion Mountain Sandstone behind us. And if you notice, it is very green. It's very green because it has a mineral called glauconite in it. And glauconite forms under low oxygen conditions, and it's probably fecal pellets. And we're looking at some of that Lion Mountain sandstone right here. And the green is that glauconite mineral, but you can also find some fossils in here. Occasionally, you can find trilobites. More commonly, see these little white areas in there? Those little white areas are shells of a brachiopod called lingula. And so we have some little shells. There's no trilobites in here, but you can sometimes find them, and a whole lot of that glauconite. Now, glauconite overall is not a rare mineral. What makes this outcrop so special is it's the only place in the world where we see that much glauconite. You almost never see it in such concentrations. And that's one of the reasons geologists come from all over the world to take a look at this place. Now, another thing you might notice in that outcropping behind us, there's some structural geology. And if you pay careful attention, you will see normal faults and a nice little horst surrounded by graben. And what happens is you have some tensional stress, there's a little bit of pull-apart stress that ended up creating some of those faults and that horst and graben. And this is a world-famous location that geologists come to check out that green glauconite. Here we are at the Devil's Waterhole looking at some of the oldest rocks of the Texas Hill Country. And behind me you'll see a kind of pinkish colored rock. That's the Valley Springs gneiss. There's also the Pack Saddle schist, and those date to about 1.23 billion years old. But I really would like to bring your attention to a very special metamorphic rock here. This is a metamorphic rock called migmatite. And what makes it special is it got so hot that it started to melt. And remember, felsic minerals melt at a lower temperature than mafic ones. So as this migmatite began to melt, we get these light-colored felsic mineral areas that we call the leucosome, and we get these darker-colored mafic mineral areas called the melanosome. And the leucosome melted, the melanosome did not. And so this is unique because it is one of these partially melted metamorphic rocks. Now, other things that we can tell here in these rocks is that these were deformed numerous times over the course of their long history. And how do we know that? We have foliations that go in different directions. And we know these rocks were under some very extreme deformation, extreme stress, because let's take a look at something a little ways up here. What we have right here is something called boudinage. So notice there's this very fat area here of this white material, and then it gets thinner and a little fatter, and then thinner and fatter. Well, this happens when this material was originally just all the same thickness, but as it's put under a lot of stress and strain and it deforms, it works its way into these kind of sausage-like links, which we call boudinage, these fatter and thinner areas. And that shows us that these rocks have been deformed numerous times in their long history. Here we are at the Coal Creek Serpentinite, and these are incredibly special rocks, unique not just to Texas, but also to the entire Grenville orogeny. About 1.3 billion years ago, these rocks were part of Earth's mantle. They were ultramafic rocks. And during part of the Grenville orogeny, we had subduction in this area. And when subduction occurs, you sometimes can get abduction occurring. Now, that's abduction, not abduction. We're not kidnapping the rocks. In abduction, basically pieces of the sea floor and the uppermost mantle can get scraped up and added to the continent. And that's what happened here. Now, while that was happening, these ultramafic igneous rocks were serpentinized into these green minerals that we see behind us. Well, as the Grenville orogeny continued, and we got high-grade regional metamorphism, these rocks were deserpentinized. But then late in the Grenville orogeny, granite intrusions came into this area, and the deformation and metamorphism associated with those granite intrusions ended up reserpentinizing these rocks. So these have had a long and torturous history to get to be what they look like today. Now, I said they were unique not just to Texas, but also to the entire Grenville orogeny, which extends from here into Labrador in Canada. Why are they so unique? It is the only place along that whole mountain building event where we have mantle rocks exposed at Earth's surface. Here we are at the South Fork of the San Gabriel River, and we are looking at dinosaur tracks. These tracks belong to a predatory dinosaur called an Acrocanthosaurus. Acrocanthosaurus lived in the Cretaceous in places like Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado. And these tracks can tell us a lot about Texas at the time period when these rocks were deposited. Well, first of all, trackways like this, we can tell things like how tall the dinosaur was and how fast it was moving. We can do that based on how big the footprints are and then how far apart the footprints are. The stride length is what we call it. We use something called Alexander's equation. And Alexander's equation only works for organisms that walk with their legs directly under them, like humans, birds, dinosaurs. Does not work for things like reptiles, where their legs are to the side and they kind of do this wiggly thing when they move. Okay, so we took Alexander's equation and measured this trackway and figured out that this Acrocanthosaurus stood about 6 feet at the hip, so that's basically up to here, the leg, Add the rest of the dinosaur onto that and you have a pretty big predator. And we figured out that the dinosaur was moving about 9 miles an hour. So not running, just going for a nice brisk walk. Well, what else do these rocks tell us? A little bit over that way, we have what are called mud cracks. And I think everyone has seen mud cracks when, like, the dirt behind their house dries out, right? You see these kind of polygonal cracks forming. Well, those form in places where you have wet times and then dry times. Well, here, this was a tidal flat. A tidal flat meaning that when the tides came in, it's wet, and then when the tides go out, it's dry, and that's why we have the mud cracks there. So now we can take these dinosaur footprints, and the mud cracks, and the rock type here, and get a picture of what Texas was like at the time these were formed. These are from about 100 million years ago. They belong to the Glen Rose limestone. And 100 million years ago, we were right on the edge of what's called the Western Interior Seaway. This was a shallow sea that stretched all the way from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Arctic Ocean and basically cut North America into 2 parts. Now let's take all of that and picture that about 100 million years ago, it was a warm summer evening on a tidal flat. We have a dinosaur walking through the mud at a nice brisk walk, probably looking for dinner, and leaves these footprints behind. And then the tides rise and bring a little bit of sediment that covers up those footprints and preserves them. Time passes, and 100 million years later, the San Gabriel River carves out this area, removes that protective rock, and reveals these footprints here for us to see, and for us to get a picture of what Texas in that long, distant day in the past looked like. And we're back in my dining room. That was just a small taste of the geology of Texas. Remember, we just looked at things in this part of the state. There is so much more that the state has to offer. You can go along the Gulf Coast and see coastal processes. You can head out to the Big Bend country where there's recent volcanism and tectonic activity. Head off towards El Paso. You'll be sitting in a continental rift system. If you head up to this area around Post and Snyder, they are excavating fossils from the sedimentary rocks there of these fascinating mammal-like reptiles called synapsids, like Dimetrodon. These are amazing creatures from the days before the dinosaurs. So what I hope you get from this virtual field trip is the idea that look around you. There is a lot of fascinating geology right here in the state of Texas.